"You're not fit for this job," Sarah McAllister said with a cold smile. Her eyes swept over him, dismissing him without a second thought. John, a simple mechanic, stood before the board of directors in a sharp suit, but his worn hands betrayed his true profession. His daughter, little Emma, sat quietly in the back, her small eyes watching every move. They had told him this was his chance. But not like this. Not with these people. He was an outsider, a stranger in a room full of power. And Sarah? She was the queen of this empire. She leaned back in her chair, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're just a mechanic. What makes you think you can handle a job like this?" The board laughed. The room was thick with mockery. John didn't flinch. He simply met her eyes. A stillness spread through him. "I'm not here to prove myself to you," he said quietly. "I'm here to show you something you didn't expect." The words hung in the air. The laughter slowly died. Sarah tilted her head, curiosity creeping into her gaze. "Go ahead," she said, her challenge clear. "Fix it or leave." John stepped forward. His hands, once accustomed to car engines and grease, now glided over the polished surface of a high-tech console. He had seen this before. It wasn't a car. It wasn't a machine. But it was a system that needed fixing. With a steady hand, he began typing, eyes never leaving the screen. The seconds stretched. Sarah's smug expression faltered as John worked with an effortless precision. She had underestimated him. Her words rang in her ears, her arrogance turning to doubt. What was he doing? This wasn't in the plan. The room fell silent. The ticking of a distant clock seemed louder with every passing second. John's fingers paused over the keyboard. A moment of stillness. Then he hit enter. Sarah's gaze dropped to the screen, her face going pale. A complex error code flashed in front of her, followed by a number. $700 million. Her empire. Her pride. She had been blind. "You missed something," John said, his voice steady. "This is your mistake." Sarah's mind raced. She stared at the screen in disbelief. How had he found it? How did he know? The board looked around at each other, their faces now showing panic. The woman who had dismissed him, the woman who had laughed, now sat frozen in her chair. John didn't need to explain further. He simply turned to the door. Next time, he said softly, "Be careful who you underestimate." John stepped into the elevator, the soft hum of the machine blending with the buzz of his thoughts. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. Sarah had looked at him like he was nothing. But now she had to reckon with him. The silence was deafening as the doors slid open to the executive floor. He adjusted his jacket and walked down the hallway, each step deliberate, calm. Behind him, Emma's tiny footsteps echoed, almost like a heartbeat in the stillness of the building. When they reached Sarah's office, he could already hear voices inside. Her laughter had faded, but the tension was palpable. The board members were huddled around, still processing what had just happened. They didn't expect this. Neither did she. John didn't knock. He just opened the door. The room went quiet, Sarah's eyes met his, narrowing slightly as she gathered herself. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight, her earlier confidence replaced by a hint of unease. "I came to talk," John said, his voice steady. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, some filled with curiosity, others with apprehension. "About your mistake." He walked toward the center of the room, where the screen displayed the evidence of her failure. The numbers still lingered there, haunting her. $700 million. Sarah shifted in her seat, trying to maintain her composure. "You're out of your league, John." "This isn't a place for someone like you," she said, the words sharp, almost desperate. John looked at her, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding. "Maybe you don't know who I am." His words hung in the air, thick with the weight of everything unsaid. The room was still. The board members shifted uneasily. Sarah swallowed, her fingers drumming on the table. "What exactly are you trying to say?" she demanded. John leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "You think you can hide everything with money and power. But there's more to this than you can control." He paused, letting the words settle between them. "I wasn't just a mechanic. I didn't just fix cars." He watched Sarah's face tighten. "I used to run a company. I ran things for people who needed them fixed. Real problems. Not just broken machines, but broken systems." The room grew colder. The tension was palpable. Sarah couldn't hide the flicker of surprise in her eyes. "You were in charge?" she asked, almost whispering. "In a way," John replied. "But I learned that the biggest problems aren't the ones everyone sees. They're the ones that hide, the ones you think you can bury." He glanced at the screen again, his gaze hardening. "Your mistake? It's just one of many. And I'm not done yet." Sarah stared at him, her mouth slightly open, but no words came out. The room was silent, save for the sound of Emma's soft breathing beside him. John stood tall, unshaken, his eyes meeting Sarah's. She was no longer the predator. Now she was the prey. "You're going to fix it. Or it's going to fix you," he said, his voice low but full of certainty. He turned, walking away without a glance back, leaving Sarah to face the consequences of her own arrogance. As the elevator doors closed behind him, John's mind was clear. He had done what he came here to do. And now it was up to her to figure out what to do with the truth. John sat in his old truck, the engine humming softly beneath him, while the city sprawled ahead. Emma, still quiet, clutched her stuffed bear in the passenger seat. It had been a long day. A long week. He had come here for more than just a job. He had come to show them that the world was bigger than the one they thought they controlled. That night, after putting Emma to bed, he sat in the dim light of his garage. Tools lay scattered across the workbench, but his mind was far from fixing engines. He wasn't done with Sarah yet. The truth was, he hadn't expected it to be this easy. But the room, the faces, the arrogance. It had all been too much. He had been dismissed, underestimated. But not anymore. Sarah had made a mistake. And it was his to fix, or rather, expose. The next morning, he received a call. A number he didn't recognize. Mr. Evans, we need to talk. It was a man's voice, calm but firm. I'm with the board at Williams Group. You left us with some important questions yesterday. Can you meet with us today? John didn't hesitate. I'll be there, he said, the words already feeling like a challenge. The meeting was scheduled for noon. When he arrived at the glass tower, he was met by a security guard who eyed him with curiosity. No one had expected him. No one had believed he would follow through. John walked through the sleek corridors, his boots echoing against the polished floors. Sarah's office was at the end of the hall. Her door was closed, but through the frosted glass, he could see the shadow of someone moving inside. He knocked once, sharply. The door opened. Sarah stood, her usual confidence replaced with a hint of caution. Mr. Evans, she said, her voice colder than usual. I didn't expect you to come back. John didn't smile. You made a mistake, Sarah. A big one. She blinked, her eyes narrowing. What are you talking about? He stepped into the room, his eyes meeting hers. I'm talking about your $700 million mistake. And the fact that you have no idea how deep it goes. He could see the shift in her face, the tightening of her jaw. Sarah wasn't used to being confronted like this. You think you can just waltz in here and make threats? She asked, though there was no confidence in her voice now. I'm not threatening you, John replied, his voice calm but unwavering. I'm telling you the truth. You've been playing a dangerous game, and you didn't even realize it. The board members sat quietly at the table, watching the exchange, unsure of what to do next. Sarah's eyes flicked toward them, but none of them spoke. You thought you could bury the problem, John continued, his words steady. But you're not the only one who can uncover the truth. He pulled out a folder from his bag and set it on the table. It was filled with documents, figures, and charts, proof of the errors, the cover-ups, the hidden liabilities. Sarah stared at it, her face drained of color. How did you? She started, but she couldn't finish. I've been around long enough to know when something doesn't add up, John said. And now you're going to fix it. Or it's going to fix you. The room went silent. Sarah's gaze flickered between John and the board members, but no one spoke. You've got a choice, Sarah, John said, his voice softening just slightly. You can keep pretending nothing's wrong, or you can face the reality. But either way, I'm not going anywhere. With that, he stood up, gathering the folder. Emma's small face appeared in the doorway, her hand tugging at the hem of his shirt. John smiled down at her, his quiet strength unwavering. Sarah's eyes followed him as he left, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She hadn't expected him to be the one to uncover the truth. She hadn't expected him to have the power to change everything. The next few days were a blur. John sat at his kitchen table, staring at the documents spread out in front of him. He'd exposed the problem, but now the weight of it all pressed on him. Sarah and the board hadn't made any moves yet, but he knew they would. The quiet before the storm was always the hardest part. Emma played with her toys in the corner, her laughter breaking through the silence, a small beacon of calm amidst the tension. The phone rang. It was the same number from before. Mr. Evans, this is Samuel Clark. the attorney for Williams Group, the voice on the other end said, "We need to meet again. The board has reviewed your findings." John's pulse quickened. He didn't have to say much. The truth had already spoken for itself. "I'll be there," he said, hanging up before the words even settled in his mind. The meeting was scheduled for the next afternoon. Sarah sat at the head of the table as John walked in, her sharp gaze meeting his, but there was something different in her eyes now. It wasn't contempt. It was something closer to uncertainty. "Mr. Evans," she began, her voice still firm but with an edge of hesitation. "We've reviewed your claims. There's no easy way to say this, but you're right." John nodded, folding his arms across his chest. "You're going to fix it then?" he asked, his tone calm, but there was a fire burning underneath. "We are," Sarah said, her eyes avoiding his for a moment before she met his gaze again. "But there's more to it, John. Much more. This isn't just about a mistake. There are people involved who will stop at nothing to keep it quiet." The room grew tense. The other board members looked between each other, their faces unreadable. "Who?" John asked, his voice quiet, but cutting through the thick silence like a knife. "That's not something we can discuss right now," Sarah replied. "But we need your help." John leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "My help? After you tried to shut me down, after everything." Sarah swallowed, then nodded. "Yes. We need someone who isn't afraid to do what's necessary. This is bigger than we thought." The words hung in the air, but John didn't react. He didn't need to. He already knew what he had to do. "I'm not in this for the money, Sarah," he said slowly, his voice steady. "I'm here for the truth. If you want my help, you're going to have to trust me." Sarah stared at him for a long moment before finally nodding. "We'll trust you," she said quietly. "But we need you to take this further. We can't fight this alone." The board members shifted uncomfortably, but none of them spoke. John stood, his decision made. "Then we start with the people who think they can bury the truth," he said, his voice hardening. "And I'm not going anywhere until it's all out in the open." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You're playing with fire, Sarah," he added over his shoulder. "Be careful. Some things burn you from the inside out." The door clicked shut behind him, and the room was left in an uneasy silence. Sarah watched him go, her thoughts racing. She had never expected it to get this far, but now she couldn't stop it. Not without facing the consequences of what they had all overlooked. The next morning, John woke up early, as he always did. The quiet of his home felt different today. Emma was still asleep, tucked beneath her blanket, the soft rise and fall of her chest steady and peaceful. He didn't want to wake her. Not yet. He needed time to think. The meeting yesterday had shifted something in him. He hadn't expected Sarah to crack so easily, but there was still more to do. More pieces to uncover. The city outside his window stirred to life, but for him, time had slowed. A calm before the storm. John grabbed a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table. His fingers traced the edge of the papers scattered in front of him. He wasn't just fighting for the truth. He was fighting for something bigger. something no one else seemed to see. The phone rang again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Evans, the voice on the other end said, a man's voice, calm but urgent. We've decided to move forward. We need your help. John sat up straight, the coffee in his hand forgotten. What do you mean? He asked, his voice steady. The board, the man continued. We need you to help us clean up this mess. It's bigger than we thought. The company's integrity is at stake. We need someone who can fix this before it goes public. John's thoughts raced. You want me to help cover this up? He asked. The silence on the other end was heavy. No, the voice replied finally. We want you to help fix it. The right way. We can't do this alone. John leaned back, his mind spinning. He knew this was coming. He had expected it. But now that it was here, the weight of it settled on him like 1,000 pounds. I don't work for you, John said, his voice low but firm. I'm not here to clean up your mess. I'm here to make sure the truth comes out. The man on the other end sighed, but John didn't wait for him to respond. He hung up the phone and set it down gently. He wasn't a man of many words, but this was different. This wasn't about fixing things on a car anymore. This was about fixing something much bigger than himself. John stood up and walked to the garage. The tools were waiting. He had his work cut out for him. As the sun rose higher, he knew what he had to do. Sarah and the board weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. But John had something they didn't. He had the truth. And no one could take that away. The sound of the garage door opening echoed through the empty driveway. The day was just beginning, but for John, the real work was already underway. He was ready. He had always been ready. John sat in his truck, staring at the Williams Group building from the parking lot. The city bustled around him, but he felt detached from it all. His focus was clear, sharp. Sarah and the board had made their decision, but now it was his turn to make his move. The truth was out there, hidden in the paperwork, the errors they tried to bury. He just needed to bring it into the light. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the street. He checked his watch. It was time. He stepped out of the truck, the door closing softly behind him. His boots hit the pavement with purpose as he walked toward the building. No hesitation. He wasn't nervous. He was ready. Inside, the atmosphere was different than last time. The tension in the air was palpable. It wasn't just about the numbers anymore. It was about survival. Sarah stood by the conference table, her arms crossed. Her face was a mask of professionalism, but John could see the crack in her armor. She knew what was coming. The board members sat around the table, their eyes shifting between Sarah and John, unsure of what to expect. Mr. Evans, Sarah said, her voice steady but lacking its usual confidence. We've reviewed the information you provided. John didn't respond. He didn't need to. The weight of the situation was enough to speak for him. Sarah's gaze flickered briefly to the papers on the table, and for a split second, John saw her composure crack. We need to talk about next steps, she continued, her voice tight. We can't let this go public. John leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "That's not your decision to make anymore," he said, his voice calm but firm. The room fell silent. Sarah's face flushed slightly, but she didn't back down. "You don't understand the consequences, Mr. Evans," she said. "This could destroy everything." John smiled softly, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe it needs to be destroyed," he said quietly. "Maybe it's the only way to rebuild." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Sarah's gaze hardened. "I can't let you do this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't have a choice," John replied. "This isn't just about the company. It's about accountability. About doing the right thing." Sarah stood there, her eyes fixed on him. "And if I refuse," she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Then you'll see just how far I'm willing to go to make sure the truth comes out," John said. He stood up, his eyes scanning the room. He could feel the weight of their stares, the uncertainty in the air. This was it. There was no turning back now. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "The truth is a powerful thing," he said, his voice low. "It doesn't just change people. It changes everything." With that, he walked out, leaving the board in stunned silence. Sarah stood frozen, the reality of the situation sinking in. The game had changed. And now there was no escaping the truth. The morning after the meeting, John stood in his garage, the sun casting long shadows across the floor. He had expected resistance, but he hadn't anticipated just how desperate Sarah and the board would become. Their game was far from over. The phone buzzed on the counter. It was the same number again. John picked up the receiver. "Mr. Evans," the voice on the other end said. "We need you. Now." John exhaled slowly. He already knew what this call was about. The board wasn't just asking anymore. They were begging. "What's the issue now?" he asked, his tone calm. "The deal," the voice said. "It's about to collapse. We need your help to fix it before it's too late." John leaned against the workbench, his eyes scanning the room. The weight of the situation hung heavily in the air. "I've already told you," he said quietly. "I'm not here to fix your mess. I'm here to make sure the truth comes out." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "We're not asking you to cover it up," the voice continued, now laced with urgency. "We need you to help us expose it. The right way. We can't do it alone." John's gaze drifted to the worn tools hanging on the wall. He thought about the countless hours he had spent fixing cars, making things work again. But this was something else entirely. "If you want the truth," John said slowly, "you have to face the consequences." The board had underestimated him from the start. "We'll do whatever it takes," the voice said, desperation creeping into the words. "Help us, and we'll make sure you get what you deserve." John didn't reply immediately. He could hear the urgency in the man's voice, but he didn't care. He wasn't doing this for the reward. He wasn't doing it for the recognition. He was doing it because the truth needed to be known. "Fine," he said at last. "But you do things my way. No shortcuts." There was a brief silence. "We understand," the voice said. "We'll meet you at the usual place." John hung up the phone and stood still for a moment. The decision was made. He wasn't in this to save them. He was in it to make sure the world saw what they had been hiding. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. The time for playing games was over. As he drove toward the meeting, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The closer he got, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about one company or one mistake. This was about holding those in power accountable. When he arrived, the board members were already there, waiting. Sarah stood at the front, her face a mask of composure, but John could see the fear beneath it. "Mr. Evans," she said, her voice tight. "We're ready to move forward." "Are you?" John looked at each of them. They were desperate, cornered. He didn't need to say anything. The truth was enough. He nodded once, his gaze never leaving Sarah's. "Let's get this over with." The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. John pulled the documents from his bag and placed them on the table. "This is everything," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And this time, there's no turning back." Sarah's eyes flickered as she glanced at the papers. The truth was right in front of them now. And they couldn't escape it. The game had changed. And this time, it was John's rules they had to follow. John sat in the dim light of the meeting room, his eyes fixed on the documents laid out before him. The room was silent, heavy with anticipation. Sarah and the board members glanced at each other, the tension palpable. They had agreed to move forward, but John knew they were still hoping to turn things around. They weren't ready for what was coming. "You understand," John began, his voice calm. "This is bigger than just a few bad numbers." Sarah shifted in her seat, her gaze steady, but filled with uncertainty. "We know," she replied. "But it's not just about the money. It's about the future of the company." John nodded slowly. "And that future depends on what you're willing to face." He slid a set of documents across the table, the papers rustling softly as they moved. "These are the pieces you've been trying to hide," he continued, his voice low but clear. "The truth. The full truth." The board members leaned forward, their curiosity piqued, but no one spoke. Sarah opened the documents, her fingers trembling slightly. She glanced at the first page, her expression hardening as she read. "How did you get this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't matter how I got it," John said quietly. "What matters is what you're going to do with it." The room was still. The board members exchanged uneasy looks, but no one made a move. Sarah's eyes flicked back to the papers. She had known this day would come. She just hadn't expected it to be him, the quiet mechanic, the man they had dismissed, who would be the one to expose everything. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said, her voice tight. "You've made your point. You've exposed our mistake. But you don't need to take us down further." John leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm not here to take you down, Sarah," he said, his voice firm. "I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen again." The words hung in the air. The silence stretched. The weight of everything they had hidden was finally coming to light. Sarah closed the documents, her fingers brushing over the edges as if to steady herself. She looked at the board members, then back at John. "What do you want?" she asked. "What do you need from us?" John didn't answer right away. He knew what he wanted. He had always known. He didn't want their money, their power, or their position. What he wanted was something simpler. Something more important. "I want accountability," he said, his voice steady. "I want you to fix this. Not just the company, but the way you do business. The way you treat people." The room was silent, no one daring to speak. Sarah swallowed, her gaze dropping to the papers in front of her. She had no answer. She had no choice. John stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the room once more. He wasn't leaving empty-handed this time. "Fix it," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "Or I'll make sure the world knows what you've been hiding." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the board in stunned silence. As the door clicked shut behind him, Sarah remained still, her mind racing. The truth was out, and there was no going back now. The days following the meeting were a blur. John stayed in his quiet rhythm, focused on his work, but the weight of what he had set in motion never left him. He couldn't shake the image of Sarah's face when he left the room. It had been a mix of fear and realization, and that was the last thing he had expected to see. He didn't care about the money, or the power, or the deals that would come next. For him, it was all about what was right. The truth had a way of creeping up on people, and he had seen it time and time again. It was unavoidable. The phone rang again, and this time it wasn't a call he had anticipated. John, the voice on the other end was familiar, yet distant. It was Samuel Clark, the attorney for Williams Group. "We've made a decision," he said, his tone serious. "The board wants to meet again. This time, it's different. We need to finalize everything." John let the words settle for a moment. "I'm listening," he replied, his voice steady. "We're ready to make the necessary changes," Samuel continued, "but we need your help to ensure the company moves forward. We're ready to step up and fix what's broken." John thought about it for a moment. He wasn't sure if they truly understood the gravity of the situation, but there was something in Samuel's voice that made him believe they were finally willing to listen. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "We need you on board," Samuel said. "Not just as a witness, but as someone who can help guide the company through the next steps." John exhaled slowly. He wasn't doing this for them. He wasn't doing this for anyone but himself and for the people who had been left in the wake of all their mistakes. "I'll be there," he said. The next morning, John arrived at Williams Group's headquarters, his heart beating a little faster than usual. This time, it wasn't just about proving a point. It was about ensuring that things didn't fall apart, that the company could rebuild from the ashes of its past. Sarah was already in the conference room when he walked in. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were a little less guarded than before. "You're here," she said, almost as if she couldn't believe it. "I'm here," John replied, his gaze steady. "What now?" The room was tense as the board members took their seats. They were all here, finally ready to face the consequences of their actions. The air was thick with the weight of what was at stake. "We've reviewed everything," Sarah said, her voice calm but with a hint of uncertainty. We know the road ahead won't be easy, but we're willing to do whatever it takes to fix this." John nodded. "Then let's get to work," he said. The next few hours were spent in intense discussions. They went over the plans, the legal steps, and the framework for moving forward. For the first time, John saw a genuine willingness to change. He didn't expect miracles, but this was a start. By the time the meeting ended, the board members stood, shaking hands with John. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. "For everything." John looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You've got a long way to go," he said. "But you're on the right path now." As he walked out of the building, John felt a sense of calm settle over him. The work wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, he felt like he had made a difference. The truth had set them on a new course. It was up to them to follow it.